Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new comic book movie, Joker, Folie, Deux. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So when it was released back in 2019, the original Joker movie was a very controversial, divisive film that offered a very gritty and almost disturbingly raw origin story for, Batman's iconic arch nemesis. And while much of the pre-release trepidation, I think, predictably proved to be overblown, the film did not inspire legions of people to put on clown makeup and go commit violent acts. I think the film did become somewhat of a cultural moment with its very socially conscious themes becoming a catalyst for widespread discussion and widespread debate. But I think if the original Joker felt more like the start of a very, important conversation, then unfortunately, kind of the long-awaited sequel feels a bit more like a conversation that is already growing stale. I will say the very bold creative decision to present this movie as a musical is commendable, especially in a very risk-adverse Hollywood industry, but the film just struggles to kind of recapture any of the same lightning in a bottle of its predecessor. And while not without some interesting notes, including, I think, the exploration of very provocative themes and another compelling performance by actor Joaquin Phoenix, Joker, Folie, Deux just struggles to fashion those together in any kind of satisfying melody. And as with the first film, this movie is admittedly kind of difficult to evaluate just on a single viewing, although the very unrelentingly grim tone may not invite very many subsequent viewings. But the movie almost works more effectively as a sort of thought piece than it does as a cinematic story. I think it explores several very interesting themes and concepts. It just struggles to do so in interesting ways. With its very bleak and nihilistic worldview, the first Joker movie was hardly a fun film, but it was consistently captivating and even enlightening at times. And kind of in contrast, Folie, Deux is equally grim, but it just lacks the same sort of magnetic energy that makes sort of the unabating darkness, feel more tolerable. And Joaquin Phoenix's performance, while still enthralling at times in this movie, lacks the same sort of can't look away magnetism that did earn him a very well-deserved Academy Award for the first film. And I think some of sort of the more muted performance is just due to familiarity. We've now seen this act before, but I think a lot of it is also just a byproduct of a story that just seems to frequently sideline or restrict him. Because he spends the first portion of this film as very silent and reclusive, and then much of the middle portion of the film as almost a passive participant as the story unfolds around him. And it's really only in the third act when he finally kind of re-embraces his Joker persona that some of that original spark reemerges. And joining him this time is Lady Gaga, who makes her debut as the character of Harley Quinn. And I think she does fine. She does well with at least what she's given, although her character also remains largely undeveloped and kind of relegated to the fringe of the story, at least for the last act, other than to pull her back for a few musical numbers. If the original Joker movie was almost like a Batman film without Batman, then Folie, Deux is largely a Joker film without Joker. I think the first film was kind of an effective slow burn of just escalating tension as Arthur Fleck, kind of a mentally challenged man, a victim of a very uncaring society, was pushed to sort of slowly closer and closer to the edge of, before finally snapping and, becoming the psychotic villain that we all know. And kind of rather than building on the first film's momentum and that final satisfying payoff, Folie, Deux kind of strips the story back down to the basics, to its foundation, and just starts building again from the beginning. Because, despite the very stark, I think, outward differences, namely that this film is, in fact, a musical, the sequel essentially follows the very same narrative template as the first. Because Arthur Fleck is once again a disturbed man, a victim of his surroundings on a slow descent towards kind of re-embracing that Joker persona. Only this time, the prison setting of the sequel film seems to also strip away some of the familiar ticking time bomb narrative of the first film, and kind of removes a lot of the sense of stakes and danger that did make that first film feel so gripping. But of course, we got to talk about the music, because I do think the decision to present this film as a musical is sure to be divisive. It was a decision that I found surprising and wasn't necessarily excited for. But I do think, having seen the film, that the integration of the musical elements into the more gritty drama is surprisingly, organic and believable. This is not just High School Musical featuring the Joker, because rather Arthur Fleck in prison attends a singing therapy group And through that process, music just becomes a way for him to process, his thoughts and feelings both like internally and externally. But much like many of the other aspects in this film, the musical component almost works more effectively as like in a thematic sense than it does in a very like compelling cinematic sense. I think the music does effectively communicate, Arthur's mental state, but the songs themselves are just mostly a slog. Lady Gaga, she can obviously sing, and even Phoenix is surprisingly competent, at least like for the character that he's portraying. But they are the only two characters in this movie that do sing, which just quickly becomes very repetitive. And the musical numbers that like take place internally in Arthur's head do allow for like a slightly bigger, more elaborate set pieces, but they still lack kind of the compelling spectacle of many other, musicals. And this personally, I found myself just disengaging from the story whenever another song would arrive on screen. I think the songs do provide like a creative glimpse into, Arthur's, headspace and psychology, but just too often they felt like they just completely killed the narrative momentum of the story right when the movie felt like it was finally finding its footing. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there is some stuff to be aware of. As far as language, there's heavy profanity all throughout this. I didn't keep like an exact tally, but there is a very high volume of F-bombs, as well as several other kind of more minor profanities. For violence, this isn't necessarily as violent of a movie as you might expect, and even if you've seen the first film. And most of the violence that does happen kind of takes place in sort of these like musical fantasies in Arthur's head. Because there's a scene where a character is shot in the head, and you sort of see like a quick splatter of blood out the side, and then the scene cuts away from that. And kind of during another one of those scenes, a character repeatedly, smashes another man in the head with a blunt object, and there's a man that is stabbed in the stomach, and you see some blood on his shirt. And this film does start with like an animated sequence, which I'll get into in just a second. And in that sort of animated short, the cartoon version of the Joker is beat up and left like in a puddle of his own blood. As far as sexuality, there is one brief sex scene in this movie, although both the characters in it are fully clothed at the time. But you do see them like pushed up against each other and kind of thrusting and grunting. And the scene is depicted almost in like an intentionally uncomfortable and awkward way, rather than in like any kind of like overly sensual sense. In another scene, you do see a woman kind of briefly wearing a bra, and two men do share a quick kiss on the lips, with it being heavily implied that one of them is in fact gay. As far as worldview things going on beneath the surface, I do think this is where the movie is at its best. It's not really a very like entertaining or like fun film, but it does explore some interesting themes. I think themes for Christians to engage with. And kind of the first one is just sort of the idea of reality versus fiction, because the movie, like I mentioned, begins with an animated short film called The Joker and His Shadow. And kind of initially, it just seems like a playful nod to like a Pixar-esque opening. But as the film progresses, you do realize that it serves a more important thematic function, because much of the tension like in this film is that question of whether like Arthur Fleck and the Joker are in fact the same person, or whether like Joker is just a shadow, a disturbed kind of trauma-induced fantasy of Fleck that acts more in like opposition to his more peaceful and gentle demeanor. And at least that's like the case that Arthur Fleck's lawyers attempt to make in the film in order to prevent him from earning the death sentence. And Arthur wrestles with this question himself. There's a scene where he's speaking to the jury where he gives like an incomplete joke where he says, "Knock, knock, who's there? Arthur Fleck, who?" And kind of without the punchline to that joke, it does sort of, represent just his confused search for like who he truly is. And the film doesn't give very easy answers to that question. In one sense, Arthur is clearly a disturbed individual that is prone to very psychotic fantasies detached from reality. But in another sense, kind of these fantasies do seem to be somewhat like an escapist way to just avoid confronting the truth and the consequences of his horrible actions. And eventually he does like almost like break down and confess that there is no Joker, seeming to finally just accept responsibility for his deeds. And the idea that like, it wasn't just the shadow that sinned, but the shadow and the man are one and the same. And from a Christian perspective, it is an interesting theme to ponder. The idea that like our sinful nature is not just like a shadow of ourselves, but is the result of like the total depravity of our souls. And kind of like ironically, the prison guards in this sort of jubilantly sing, "Oh, when the saints come marching in," each morning as they wake up the inmates. But the film itself provides a very like starkly honest and like uncomfortable reminder that all have sinned and like no one can do good outside of God. God. I think this movie doesn't necessarily provide a lot of hope, but it does effectively remind us of our need for it. I think another interesting theme in this is just like the fickle nature of people and crowds, because throughout this film, like the prison inmates kind of repeatedly watch classic Looney Tune cartoons of Pepe Le Pew, that's, the lovesick skunk whose affections are just continually left unreciprocated. I think that cartoon does serve as kind of an apt metaphor for this film's theme of just sort of chasing after that elusive love. Because Arthur is presented almost as like a type of like Frankenstein's monster, as a person who just longs and yearns for acceptance in a world that continually only looks at him with disgust. But for the first time, that seems to change with his budding romance with Harley Quinn, because when asked on a TV interview, what has changed from the time of the events of the first film, he responds, "I'm not alone anymore." And kind of in a similar way, the large crowds that begin to gather outside of the courthouse in this film, many with faces painted like the Joker, seem to show to Arthur that he has finally found that love, that acceptance, that belonging that he has always yearned for. But the tragedy in this film is kind of that slow realization that the people don't truly love Arthur Fleck, they only love the Joker, and that they only accept him as an icon and not as a person. And the moment Arthur in this begins to lose his own conviction about that identity as the Joker and reverts back to merely being Arthur Fleck, kind of the crowds that once cheered and revered him quickly abandon him, kind of like everyone else in his life, and instead look to latch onto someone else that can better serve their selfish purposes. And in almost like a meta sense, even I think audience frustration at this film's like stubborn refusal to actually give very actual Joker action is almost like an extension of that theme that we don't really want the human drama, we just sort of want the villainous spectacle. And it's not hard to draw like real world parallels to this, particularly in the realm of politics, where politicians must adopt like almost certain personas or characters to satisfy the projected fantasies of their potential voters, or even in like a cancel culture mindset where mobs will instantly turn on the people that they once loved the minute they cease to sort of live up to that perfect ideal and use that they desire for them, leading to many kind of groveling apologies from people that attempted to go off script. Because humans were created for love, and yet we are fundamentally selfish, we're fundamentally fickle creatures. And I think seeking to satisfy longing for love in humans alone will inevitably lead to frustration and brokenness. But thankfully, Christians can take heart that God promises in Hebrews 13:5, "I will never leave you or forsake you." So overall, Joker Folie à Deux is just a tricky film to put your finger on. I'm not even entirely sure exactly how I feel about this film myself. I think there are some individual moments and ideas that do work very well in this movie, and I think its willingness to explore uncomfortable and unsettling concepts and themes does give it a depth that is rarely found in other comic book movies. At the same time, for all the interesting things that this film seems to be trying to say, there's also just a sense that it's already all been said before. I think the unexpected musical framework does give it the illusion of being a very fresh and trailblazing sequel, but too often the film just chooses to retread down familiar paths. But hey, I would love to hear what you think about this. This seems to be a film that people are going to have very mixed opinions on, so be respectful, but jump in the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. And if you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews and our Faith and Pop Culture podcast and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.